scene in the movie.
Are you a mod or a rocker?
No, I'm a mocker.
And a few months later, he used that on a television interview as though it was his own stuff. So he further kind of muddied the waters as to whether it was his line or Alan Owen's. In fact, it was Alan Owen's.
Have you any hobbies?
During the making of the actual movie, while the shooting was going on in and around London, we had a great deal of press coverage, but of course none of it was in any way critical. It was mostly pictorial. It was pictures of these fans, crowd scenes, the Beatles being chased all over the place by mobs of fans and being held back behind lines of policemen and this kind of thing. And again, there was this blurring between fact and fiction because, of course, those policemen were on this one occasion for this filming, they were actors. But in the long run, they looked like real policemen and real fans chasing the Beatles. That was the kind of coverage that we got during the making of the picture. And the reviews, I mean, weren't just sort of saying, here was a great pop group or anything like that. Of course, there was positive praise for them, for the music in the movie. But, for example, the Times of all papers, most prestigious of the lot, probably the London-based Times, talked of outbursts of goonish visual humour. Now, the goonish side of things, this related, of course, to the Goon Show of the 50s, mainly a radio phenomenon, the Goon Show, which had starred Peter Sellers and a whole team of outrageously futuristic at the time comedians, surreal comedy, which Dick Lester, the director, had brought into A Hard Day's Night superbly.
Where are you going, John?
She's going to show me a stamp collection.
The Beatles were in the papers every day because don't forget that by now there had been an outbreak of uncontrollable outbreak, an epidemic of Beatlemania in America as well as here, and in Australia and on the continent. So the thing had gone global. And therefore the coverage of the Beatles, the slightest thing that happened made enormous headlines. When Ringo went into hospital to have his tonsils out, the fan club telephone lines in Covent Garden were absolutely inundated with calls, national calls and international calls at all hours of the day and night. And eventually the whole Covent Garden switchboard, the Covent Garden area switchboard at the telephone exchange became jammed. And we actually had a unique arrangement with the Covent Garden telephone exchange that they would put up bulletins on Ringo's condition, his state of health, on a big blackboard in the exchange, and the operators were intercepting the calls and saying, I can't put you through to that number, but if you're calling about Ringo Starr, I can tell you that, and they would read off the board and say what Ringo's latest state of health was in the hospital. There were twin premieres in July for A Hard Day's Night. One of them, of course, in Liverpool, Beatles' hometown, and the other in London's West End. And an amazing number of fans turned out for each of these. And the media coverage, of course, of the number of people, that was no surprise to us. And it would not have surprised us, of course, to get a lot of coverage from the music press and from the kind of rock journalists generally in the national newspapers. But what was pretty exhilarating was to see how the serious film critics actually took this film and realised readily that it was more than the usual teeny bop movie and actually sort of reviewed it in a serious and sensible kind of a way. So Beatlemania now is in full swing globally, if you like, certainly particularly in Britain and America, and it is now established that the Beatles are the world's #1 pop and rock group of the era. But now the effect of A Hard Day's Night took them out of the concert range into the film, the theatrical range, if you like, and the parents who went along to see the movie with their kids were impressed with the Beatles on an entirely fresh level. I hate to use that corny expression, all-round entertainers, but they were. In other words, they were family entertainers rather than being just a sensation for the kids. By the middle of 1964, coincidentally with the coming out of the movie. My job as the Beatles press officer had become much more of a, shall we say, protective and selective rather than straightforwardly promotional. I was no longer just going out looking for coverage, straight and simple, on the Fab Four. I was now able to be more selective and choose what we did, and their views were sought on a wider and wider range of, first, entertainment industry topics, and of course later on generally on social and political matters, which pop stars weren't supposed to talk about. Pop stars were supposed to be seen and not heard. Pop stars didn't do a lot of things in those days. They didn't get married, they didn't talk about religion, and they stood up there in their gold lame suits on a pedestal and sang Pat Boone type songs. That's what pop stars did pre-Beatles. But now the Beatles brought out opinions of their own. They were being accepted as spokesmen for their generation. The depiction of the press, of the media in A Hard Day's Night was half fictionalised. What happened with Alan Owen is that he kind of amalgamated what happened typically in Washington at a consular reception for the Beatles and what might happen at a press conference. Now, they're two very different things. Press conferences that the Beatles used to give in cities all around the world, it was my job to set those conferences up, and those were much more formal affairs where you had the press sitting in rows and asking questions. Now, those were much more kind of serious working affairs, if you like, than the press party, the reception that's depicted in the movie. But of course, this was artistic license on Alan Owen's part, because it wouldn't have been particularly entertaining to see rows and rows of journalists putting their hands up and being pointed at by me to ask the next question.
How do you like your girlfriends to dress?
That wasn't really what happened when the press were talking to the Beatles along the road, although press conferences did in themselves go through sort of various stages. They started out in the earliest days, of course, of the Beatles being asked the stupidest and most basic of questions. How old they were they all from Liverpool, was that really their hair, and on all this kind of thing. What do you call your haircut? I call mine Fred, all that kind of stuff. What happened was that whenever they were asked an awkward question and they felt that they were backed up into a corner, they very often fought their way out of that corner by going for the laugh line. By just coming back, instead of answering the question, straight and simple, they would come back with some hilarious laugh line that would get them off the hook, also make the journalist in some cases look pretty much of a fool for asking such a daft question. But it did mean that the press conferences more and more turned into straightforward variety shows, vaudeville shows, if you like, with an audience rather than simply working press, where you get these sort of great roars of laughter and applause, and the turn, you know, that these four mop-top comedians at the front there sort of coming back with very clever one-liners all the time, and the audience roaring with laughter as though it's a show. So it's very strange, because it's almost as though fact and fiction really had come full circle, and the stuff depicted in A Hard Day's Night was now for real.
Boys, come on, your press conference.
Where have you been? It's your press conference we're arranging. Get out.
All right, give us a couple of shakes to get our
Give
breath,
us
will
a
you?
shout when it's over.
It was a job that they thoroughly enjoyed in the end, probably one of the most enjoyable projects that they did during their entire lives.